Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining. The ICF Training and Technical Assistance team is honored to welcome you to this California Housing and Community Development Workshop offered through the Emergency Solutions Grants Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Services Contract. I'm Chris Pitcher from ICF, and I'll be hosting today's session. I'll also do a few slides. Today's a practical application session. This is part 2 of our racial equity in data. So we're calling this racial equity in data in action. So this really gives us a chance to go from that large group training to really hands-on stuff. What can we do to help you move forward your local racial equity and data analysis? So thank you for joining us. It's my pleasure to hand it off to our first presenter today, and that's Mary Francis. Mary Francis, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to head to the next slide. Welcome, everyone. I'm going to kick us off with a round of introductions. I'm Mary Francis Kenyon, also with ICF. I use she, her pronouns, and happy to be back here with you all today in this smaller group format. I'll hand it over to Alyssa, who will introduce herself. And next slide, please, Chris.
Thanks, Mary Francis. Hi, everyone. Happy to be here with you today. My name is Alyssa Parrish. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm Asian.
Cool. So for today's agenda, you all are welcome to introduce yourself in the chat. This is a smaller group, and we are going to spend some time talking with you as opposed to at you today. We really encourage participation because we want you all to take advantage of this small group setting. So for today's learning objectives, we're going to cover our learning objectives, and then we're going to spend some time doing some polling and also getting grounded in our engagement agreements. We're going to talk about what Stella P is and what it is not. And from there, we're going to do a little deeper dive into what a disparity is and talk about some data quality stuff for you all. And then from there, we're actually going to have a live preview of Stella P. We've been fortunate to get the blessing from one of the communities in California to do a walkthrough with their data. Next slide. You can see our adorable pictures, including the ones with the little people, our little humans. We can go right on in. We're probably going to do about 20-25 minutes of presentation, and then again, we really want to spend some time diving right into Stella P and having conversations with you all. Next slide. All right, first up, we want to hear from you. In just a moment, we're going to launch a poll in Zoom. Our poll question number 1 is, how comfortable are you with Stella P? And the answers range from what is Stella P? Never seen it, never heard of it, to I've dabbled, to I've looked at it and I understand what it says, versus you've maybe presented to your community around Stella P. Or your community has effective strategies to create system shifts based on the data there.
I'm gonna wait just a couple more seconds so everyone can answer. Okay.
Oh, cool.
The results.
So it looks like most folks either aren't too sure what Stella P is and are here to learn more, which is super exciting because we are going to have a live demo, to dabbling, and just a small percentage of folks that have looked at it and understand what it says. So this is going to be exciting. All right, next slide. So today's learning objectives, which will be great for that 55%, we're going to help you understand Stella P and what's available in the data. We're also going to focus on what is not available in Stella P and where else you can take a look at some data points to more comprehensively understand the homeless response system. From there, we're going to talk through some effective strategies to really tease apart data quality issues from disparities and equities, which is really critical to being able to effectively analyze your Stella P data. And then, of course, we'll do our live walkthrough. You all may notice this is not a webinar format. That is with great intentionality, because you don't have to chat your questions. You can kind of raise your hand and we can answer as we go along. So it should be fun. Next slide. All right, so just for some basic grounding before I hand it over to Chris in a moment, Stella P is really a great starting point. It's not all you need, though, to comprehensively understand your system. As you will see during the preview, Stella P is very oriented and steeped in our quantitative data. And if you've been at previous presentations, the message that you will always hear from our team is that without quantitative data, you have a really incomplete picture, and you can't effectively tell your story without the human experience to speak to that. Next up, you want to focus, our focus today is going to be a walkthrough of Stella P, but we're going to actually talk about some different data that you might need to include in your interrogation. Interrogation sounds like a heavy word. I promise you it's not. It's just really about being very thorough in your review of the different data elements and painting the clearest picture possible with what you have at your resource, and of course, folding in that, that qualitative data, that human experience, if you're able. Last piece, data quality really matters, right? If you don't have good data quality in your system, you're going to run into some challenges with interrogating your data, because it might misrepresent the story that's actually happening or unfolding within your community. Next slide. All right, so you all have seen this before. We do have some engagement expectations. We just ask that during today's session, for each of you as participants to be present and listen actively. And I'm emphasizing this, I probably can't emphasize it enough. We don't want to talk at you today, we want to talk with you. So please engage with us and with each other. There are so many great lessons to be learned from your fellow community members. Definitely maintain mutual respect for differing viewpoints. Don't seek a one-size-fits-all approach. We want you to challenge the way we have historically responded to homelessness, and Stella P is just one of those steps that we can take to do that. We ask that you see yourself as part of the solution and continue to think about prioritizing attendance in future sessions. We've got a couple more of these small group sessions in the pipeline, and we'd love to have you join us. Also, you can participate in the chat and polls, and today you can join us on video. We'd love to have you. All right, I think I'm turning it over to Chris for the next set of slides.
You are. Thanks, Mary Frances. And thank you all for joining us. I see a lot of folks who I know and names I know. So thank you for being with us today to talk through racial equity and data, what we can do here in action. I'm going to start with Stella P. What is it? Here's a screenshot. This is part of it. I think it helps to understand that Stella P, which stands for performance, is an analysis tool. It is built from HMIS data. It comes from that data that you collect from each person experiencing homelessness in your community and rolls up to your COC level and ultimately rolls up to the national level as well. So it's really important to understand. Unlike most HUD things, Stella does not stand for anything. The P stands for performance, but Stella itself is just a name. I believe it came out of work that was entitled SPIST or SPIST, and I don't think HUD liked the way it sounded, so they changed the name to something different, which is Stella. And I think everyone likes to say Stella, whether you want to, really draw it out like I'm going to on the next slide, or just to say Stella P. But know that Stella P has a sister that we haven't met yet named Stella M that will be forthcoming, but we can't really show that to you today. So I'll get a little bit more to what it is in the next slide. So LSA is another word you will want to know. This actually stands for something, the Longitudinal Systems Analysis, LSA. Many of you are going through the LSA process today, or this week, or last week, or next week, or the week after. We know that you're working with a lot of folks from APT associates and trying to get that LSA data in there so that you can be able to, at some point, Stellavize your data. Yes, we've created a word for what happens to your data when it's accepted through LSA and turned into Stella data. So this information in the LSA, this comes directly from your HMIS. So you're collecting this information in each project with each homeless person, rolling it up to your HMIS level and submitting that to HUD. This provides both us and both us as HUD and HUD TA providers and yourself as COC folks with critical information on households experience homelessness. What does your homeless response system look like? And we're going to have an example today of a homeless response system in California. Thankfully, our friends in Mendocino County, I know I saw Brian here, have allowed us to use their data today. So we'll be using data from Mendocino County to walk through later on some Stella P. This data will include emergency shelters, our safe havens, transitional housing, rapid housing, and permanent supportive housing, but it is not all inclusive. LSA data and Stella data is not an entire picture of your data system. It is not an entire picture of all the different projects you provide. So we definitely won't have any data on homeless prevention, street outreach, coordinated entry, services only projects. Simply don't come into Stella at this point. So understand that when you're looking at the data, it is not all inclusive. You submit this data through HDX or the HUD Data Exchange 2.0 for the federal fiscal year, October 1 to September 30. You're doing that now for 2021 data. And that will, again, populate once it's Stellavized into Stella P, which stands for performance. I promised I'd get to a slide where it had a big Stella, and this is it. So you can yell that in your head, or if you want to yell it out loud and you're on mute, go for it. This is kind of what you'll get when you see Stella. Now, Alyssa's going to walk us through all this stuff and what it actually does and looks like. But there are some important things to note. These are based on households and not individuals. That is really important to understand in our data. We will have demographic data, including our race and ethnicity data, which is why it's so important for racial equity data analysis efforts. It'll give us things like who's exiting to permanent housing, how long, how many days are folks experiencing homelessness in different types of interventions, who is returning. That's a really important thing to know from what projects or what programs are returning, what types of programs are returning. And then you'll see when Alyssa points this out, we have pathways and system maps, which I already showed you on our very first slide back there, 2 slides ago. Very detailed information that can really help you do planning for your community and work together. What it is. So I'm going to set up what it is. Alyssa's going to set up what it is not, because as I said, it is not everything to everyone, but it is a great starting point. So it's a good point for us to start as communities. It's a great baseline set of data that we can all access because you have Stella data. I see Johnny Burke from Yuba Sutter right below me. We have that for Yuba Sutter. We have that in Mendocino. We have that in all 44 COCs across California. So it's also something we all have in common and work together. It begins to identify racial disparities. It is not going to tell you them all. It is not going to even really tell you maybe most of them, specifically if you don't have all of your providers that serve our Black, Indigenous, and people of color that are in HMS. That's it. That'll be a huge hole for us as far as being able to identify racial disparities. It is useful in identifying data quality issues. As those HMIS leads on the phone can attest today, you are getting lots of back and forth with your folks from APT Associates talking about your LSA data and your flags. If you go to Twitter and follow HMIS memes, you can see a bunch of memes right now about LSA data collection, which for us HMIS nerds makes us laugh. For some of you, it's probably too close to home or maybe too close to right now. Maybe you won't want to do that, but it is something that I like to plug just because it's funny to me and clearly funny to Brian as well from Mendocino County. So with that, I'm going to hand it to Alyssa and have her begin to tell us what isn't Stella P. What can't we, what is our limitations here?
I'm actually going to hand it over to Mary Frances because I think she's
You're right. I really want to just give it to you. Sorry about that. Go ahead, Mary.
We're going to get there, Chris. We're going to get there, I promise. So I just want to quickly cover what Stella P is not. And Chris made some great highlights there as he is talking about what it can do for you. Next slide, please. So again, it's not a comprehensive snapshot. It's not a comprehensive like data assessment or analysis of your homeless response system. It is a snapshot. We know that there are some project component types that are not captured currently in Stella P. This is also not the only data that you're going to need to understand your disparities at a deeper level. It's also not a data quality tool. There are other vehicles and avenues that you can use to help with your data quality, which I'm sure Alyssa is going to touch on. And then, of course, I've already said this. I'm going to always keep reaffirming this. You'll hear this from our team all the time. It doesn't give you the story behind the data. These are numbers, folks. This is length of stay. This is, racial demographics, age demographics, gender demographics, things like that, households. But it doesn't speak to the human experience. And without that human experience, you have a really incomplete picture. Next slide. So who isn't represented in Stella, right? One of the things that Alyssa and I spend a lot of time sort of offline talking about is underrepresentation. We know that there are disparities. We know that they typically hit Black households, our Native American, Alaska Native households. We know that it hits our Latinx households, but we don't spend a lot of time talking about who might be underrepresented. A while back, I think when we were kicking this series off, we talked a little bit about pan-ethnic umbrellas and these identifiers that, we see Asian American Pacific Islander. And with those like broad umbrellas, there are a bunch of really rich cultures that might experience the homeless response system in different ways. So I'll use an example, East Coast example here. We had, when I was in Arlington County COC, we had an underrepresentation of Vietnamese individuals. And we had to explore that, right? They were underrepresented. They were just as likely to experience homelessness as some of our other populations. But we made an assumption because we can't see them in our data. We only see Asian American. We made an assumption that we were all good there. So we had to access different data sources to tell a more accurate picture and also engage with members of the Vietnamese community to hear from them around why they weren't accessing services. And that's a nice segue into the next point around who isn't represented. When we know that we have folks who are overrepresented in experiencing homelessness, right, who is underrepresented in accessing the services, whether that be coordinated entry, emergency shelter, whether that's engagement with your street outreach team. You want to look at those that are you want to look at those that are underrepresented, just as much as you focus on those who are overrepresented. You all know your communities probably way better than our team does. So I'm sure that you might be in tune, maybe through your limited English proficiency policy, around who is in your community and who might have additional language needs. That's a good data point for you all to look at to tell whether or not there might be a group who's underrepresented in accessing services. Some other questions that you want to ask when you're looking at who isn't represented is who serves, but we don't have good data on them, right? And that could mean street outreach, that could mean non-funded projects that aren't getting ESG CV funding or COC funding. You want to cast a really wide net with your different data points. Also, who is it that you need to talk to understand better, and what other data is available to understand? Some examples that stand out to me are looking at upstream systems of care. What I mean when I say upstream systems of care, those feeder systems in the homelessness, right? That could be the DV system if it sits outside of your COC. That could be the justice system. That could be the foster care system. A lot of these other sectors have really incredible data that's available, de-identified, of course, to give you some insight on on who might be underrepresented or who might not be accessing services. Next slide. Dun, dun, dun. Handing it over to Alyssa. She's our data quality guru.
All right, so we're just going to spend a little bit of time before we pivot to the demo on data quality. So next slide, please. I think most of it, oh, sorry, we're going to start out with a poll on this question. So how effective is your current data quality management program? So what is the data quality management program? It's operational, but it's not really impactful or effective. It's addressing some data quality issues, but not others. And then it's fully effective with benchmarks based on the data in our system.
Alyssa, while the poll results come in, do you want to talk a little bit about the DQMP?
Sure, and if somebody can
essentially.
find that link quickly on the HUD Exchange HMIS Lead Series landing page. I think for a long time, we were really focused on the data quality plan, right? Which is really the procedures around what we are focused on as a community related to data quality. And that really was a limited perspective on what was needed when it came to a comprehensive program or process at the community level. So when we talk about a data quality management program, the data quality plan is really just one component of that overall program. We're also talking about the incentives and enforcements that align with the data quality program. We're also talking about the roles and responsibilities of each entity related to data quality, because I think we know that data quality does not fall on the HMIS lead alone to enforce, right? So we're also looking at how is the COC involved in that process? What are the roles and responsibilities of the service providers themselves and the end users, and having those really documented so that everybody's on the same page about those. And then what does the reporting and monitoring process look like tied to data quality and the data quality management program?
Yeah, that's the most important thing, Liz, is we talked, for years and years, just having a plan, and we know that plans collect dust on the side table or wherever it is. So I think it's really important to understand the difference between those things. And Aaron just put that in put the DQMP landing page from HUD in the chat. So go ahead.
That's great. We've got, I love that only 6% asked what a DQMP is, operational but not impactful. So 67% that it's addressing some data quality issues but not others. So that aligns with what I think we've seen in other communities across country. So next question, or next slide, we're going to talk through the components of data quality quickly, hoping this is mostly, things that you all have heard before. But completeness is really thinking through how many of the data elements that are required to be entered into HMIS based on funding stream, based on project type, based on, component, whatever that looks like, how many of those are actually entered into HMIS for any given client. I think data completeness is really the easiest thing to report on, because you know what is and isn't in the system based on what's required to be in the system. Sorry, you know what is in the system based on what's required to be in the system. Timeliness is really how quickly is the data that you are collecting entered into HMIS. So a lot of communities, I think, are still functioning with, we're going to collect this information on a paper form, and then we're going to enter it into the system later. So what is the time lapse between that process? I think more and more communities are pivoting to live time data entry. So you are entering the data into the system as you are actually asking the person in front of you the questions. But I know that there have been barriers to that over time based on system functionality. And I know street outreach is one of those that is a pain point of HMIS implementations, and systems have not historically been mobile friendly. So what does that look like in a street outreach setting? Accuracy can be really difficult to measure because it's really looking at how much the data that is entered into HMIS is truly a reflection of the person's reality. And that is just harder to measure by nature than completeness, right? You know whether the data element is in there or not, but you don't know how accurate it is. So some of those key indicators of data quality or data accuracy are, I'm thinking through like approximate date homelessness started. We see that a lot, and we see the potential for, I mean, there was one approximate date homelessness started that I saw in a system that was dated like 10/1/30/21 or something, which is clearly like a miskey or a mistype, but the system didn't account for that. So when we pulled the data out to start to analyze it, it was, I mean, it was showing up as that's what the approximate date was. Some other ones are, you know, minors can't be veterans, and dates of birth typically are not the same as the project start date. Now, given you could have babies that were born on the same exact day that the family entered the project, but that is highly unlikely. So just thinking through some things that you could capture in reporting to kind of at least flag as a potential data accuracy issue. Consistency is really thinking through, is the way that I understand these data elements the same way that Chris understands these data elements? And are we presenting them to the people that we're collecting the information from in the same way so that we're getting comparable information? And I think approximate date is another example of that consistency piece. So we know that approximate date homelessness started is really defined as when was the date that this episode of homelessness started? I think there's still a lot of misinterpretation though, and depending on the intake worker, depending on how they word it to a client or a person that they are trying to get that information from, could be interpreted as when was the first time you experienced homelessness ever? And so there's just still some consistency issues with specific data elements. I think destinations is another piece. I've seen a lot of kind of fluidity between different destination options in that pick list. And I know that we have tried to work on refining those definitions over time and even updating verbiage in those pick list options to clarify further, but I think there's still some room for interpretation, which can get inconsistent. And then of course, coverage, right? Coverage of your system. How many emergency shelter providers that provide emergency shelter in your system are actually entering data into HMIS? And I don't mean to pick on emergency shelters, but I think we see that rescue missions are still somewhat of an issue depending on the community that you're in. They often provide a lot of emergency shelter, but are resistant or don't want to enter data into HMIS. So there's a coverage gap there, which does impact the LSA, it does impact system performance measures, and it really does impact overall what the community knows about their homeless response system. Next slide, please. So specifically related to Stella P and the LSA, really, some data quality issues that really impact what you're looking at in that data set. So Chris mentioned earlier that the LSA reports by household. Stella really looks at your data by household. I know, being a previous, HMIS lead, that household configuration in HMIS can get really messy really quickly because households in real life are messy, right? You have a mom who shows up at the shelter and she has 3 children with her, but the next time she presents for services, the child is elsewhere because they're staying with dad or they're staying with a family member. So now she has 2 children. So how do you remove that child from the household for now? Or how do you navigate through that between different projects or even within the same project enrollment if that household configuration changes? So that can be difficult, and just making sure that that data quality is accurate. Accurate enrollments and exits are also going to have a significant impact on Stella P. You have to make sure that you're entering everybody who is served and that they're being exited from the program after they are no longer being served. Destinations is another piece because Stella P really does have 3 kind of big performance measures that it looks at. It looks at average length of time experiencing homelessness, exits to permanent destinations, and then returns to the system after exits to permanent destinations. So if those destinations are recorded inaccurately or incorrectly for the households, then we're not going to have good data to look at. I know that emergency shelter is often a pain point, not because of the data that is collected in HMIS, but because of how it functions in real life. You have a lot of night-by-night shelters. You have this transient population that's coming in and out, and there's no expectation that the person is telling you where they're going as they exit the shelter. That's not a reality. And so you have a lot of night by night shelters that have really high missing destinations, because that's just how it functions in real life. So how can we navigate that? Is there a way that we could even collect 5 more destinations for these clients over a year's time? That gets us a little bit closer, if only a very tiny bit. Race and ethnicity data is shown in different parts of Stella P, which we will get to. The ability to disaggregate by race and ethnicity using Stella P is still limited. I know the app has done some like focus groups and forums to seek input for how they can expand that, but also recognizing that the LSA is already a really, really complicated export that has thousands upon thousands upon thousands of rows of data. So the more that we disaggregate the data, the more complicated that specific export becomes. So right now in Stella P, the only Hispanic breakout is white and Hispanic. So that's going to exclude anyone who only identifies as Hispanic and chooses not to identify with any race. It excludes anybody who identifies as Black and Hispanic, and so on and so forth. So figuring out how to incorporate more race and ethnicity disaggregation into Stella P over time is a goal. But we also have to make sure that that race and ethnicity data is captured in HMIS for the clients. Dates of birth is also really big because households, because it's run by households, it also really does report some stuff only by head of household, which I don't have. I don't have head of household on here, but that's a huge thing too, making sure that there's one and only one head of household defined in that household. So I guess that's part of household configuration, but I didn't mention it right there. And then dates of birth, because it doesn't capture specific metrics for the children in a household. Housing move-in date, I think HMIS leads are very familiar with some of the pain that comes with housing move-in date, not just the definition of it, but also just how that can be recorded in HMIS accurately. And that is important in Stella and other data sets. Approximate date homelessness started, I think I have picked on that one enough and sufficiently today, but that is also a big one. It is captured in the approximate date homelessness started, or in the average days experiencing homelessness measure, which I will show you where you can actually click to include that specific part in that measure. And then for all of you currently going through the pain that is LSA data cleaning season, you know how important that the accurate PDDEs are, or the project descriptor data elements for all of the projects in your system. That really defines which projects are pulled into your LSA to begin with, to even get visualized in Stella P. So, project type, bed inventory, I know is a huge pain point, which I'm not going to get into because that brings back bad memories. COC code, funding sources, like all of these different pieces that you as an HMIS admin, if you are an HMIS admin, have to make sure are set up on the back end of the system. Data quality matters there too. Are we ready? I think we're ready.
I'm not ready. I'm close to ready. I want to say just a few things. If there is anything that you want to ask questions about what we've covered so far, this is a great stopping point before I do our demo. So you can unmute yourself, ask your questions, raise your hand, I'll call on you, put it in the chat. You're welcome to do that. Communicate with us. This is a small group. We want to cross-learn. So that's part one. Part two is my disclaimer. And on my screen, I have my colleague from Mendocino County, Brian Klopsky, who has been gracious enough to allow us to go into his LSA from 2019, 2020. So this is older data, but it is something I had ready access to. So this does not tell a very accurate picture from Mendocino County. Brian, is there anything you'd like to say about that data before we hop into it? Because I don't want you to have to explain all of your data, but maybe you can give a context of what was happening in Mendocino County around 2019.
Sure. That year we transitioned to a new HMIS system. So we were in the middle of a data migration. And then as one of the HS admins, I was pulled into COVID public health for 10 months and provided very little admin support 2 months after we transitioned to a new system. That said, the data in 2019, 2020 is the most accurate quality filled data we've had to date. This year's is going to be much better. Our LSA has already been accepted and approved. We're done with it.
Congratulations. Thanks, you, Brian. So we will go into Mendocino County's data unless I see anyone raise a hand or anything else. Okay. Give me 1 second to transition and we will be ready to go. All right. Alyssa, are you ready? Can you see?
I am ready. So just a quick reminder, Stella P is visualized based on LSA data. The data that folks are working through now is at the COC level. And then what I heard this earlier this week from a community that Stella P is currently like shut down from being able to try and visualize anything at the local level, because you can, depending on your system functionality, you are able to run a local LSA data set. You could run it by region, you could run it by local homeless coalition, you could run it by these different kind of subsets and then visualize it or Stellarize it through HDX 2.0, and that doesn't get submitted to HUD as anything official. But I heard that functionality is currently not able to be accessed by y'all because they're making updates for the 2022 data standards changes. But just acknowledging that right now this is COC level data and based on the official submission from, as Chris mentioned, last year. So on this first screen, when you navigate to Stella in HDX2, and there's tabs across the top there, so you see the home, LSA, and the Stella P tab. So we're on that Stella P tab all the way at the top, sorry. There are different tabs kind of close to the top of the page. We're on the dashboard and the overview, the sub tab here. Yep, and you have your different performance measures and demographics. So the overview is really going to show you the total number of households that were served in the homeless system from, during the reporting period, and then also the total number of people. There are very few places in Stella P that show any kind of people counts. This is one of them, but really all these other metrics, the performance measures, are really based on households. So you see the average days experiencing homelessness for all households in the system is 98 days. You see the exits to permanent destinations for all households in the system is 25%. And then returns for all households is 15%. And the returns does have a look back here. We'll get to that later. So these are your, what I would call your universal measures for all of the households incorporated in this data set. Scrolling down a little bit, you see that we look at adult-only households, adult and child households, so families with children, and then child-only households. So it will break out your average days experiencing homelessness between those different subpopulations. I'm a little surprised to see that the adult-only average days is actually lower than adult and child or families with children average days. That's typically flipped. I mean, we typically see that adult-only households are experiencing homelessness longer in our system than families with children. Go ahead, Brian.
I can't explain that. The bulk of our adult child households were part of our CalWorks rapid rehousing housing stabilization program. And due to COVID, where they normally had very small emergency shelter motel voucher stays while waiting for permanent housing, it was pretty much open-ended year-long hotel stays for any family experiencing homelessness in the county that was part of CalWorks.
That's helpful. See, and this is what I mean by, sorry, I should have led with this. When I do Stella P analysis for communities, and I've done quite a few in the last year or so, I come away with more questions than answers, right? Because all I see are the numbers. So I would ask the question in my analysis back to the community. This looks a little bit funny. Like, what context do you have about it? Or what do you know about this? Are there specific outliers that are driving this up? Or is there some kind of local context that happened, like Brian just mentioned, that explains, this thing? We have exits by household type as well. So our adult-only households have a 23% exit to permanent destinations, and our adult and child households have a 53%. So I would ask the question of like, what is going well in the adult and child, household world that is having them exit to permanent destinations at a higher rate than our adult only? And I'm maybe the same context that you just provided, Brian, maybe something different.
Off the top of my head, most of our permanent housing programs and vouchers give a lot more preference and priority points and scoring and prioritization. Families is usually an optional point in about any sort of housing voucher or permanent supportive housing or emergency housing and things like that.
Great. And then scrolling down a little bit more, we have our returns by household type. So we see that for the adult only households, 17%, and then our adult and child households are at 7% return. So again, a difference here, where we have adult only households returning at a higher rate than our adult and child households. So I'm not going to go to the, there's a lot of information in Stella P. I'm going to focus on racial disparities and how we can navigate and analyze those and interrogate those and ask more questions, but just flagging that there's a lot more information in here. So if and when you have the chance to kind of play around in Stella P, or if you want to do some one-on-one sessions, like let us know. So if you want to click over to the system map, Chris, I am going to spend a minute on that because it's just because I think it's really cool. So the system map shows you on this left side how many households were served in the homeless response system. And then it has these different arrows with bolded, the lines are heavier or lighter depending on the percentage of folks that use that specific pathway. So for this system, we see that 86% of the households that were served in the system were served by emergency shelter and safe haven. And that, I think that aligns with what we see in a lot of systems. Again, remember that this data set does not include street outreach or coordinated entry as project types. So for those folks who entered your system through street outreach and then later accessed shelter, they're going to show up in this shelter line, even though they may have actually started in the system somewhere else. The couple of things that I look at here is like who is accessing or how many households are accessing directly rapid rehousing and PSH. Because we know that typically those project types specifically have to go through coordinated entry. And so for this 5% that's accessing rapid rehousing directly and those 5% that's accessing PSH directly, were they served by street outreach first? Were they enrolled in coordinated entry and not any other project type in HMIS? Are they coming from our DV partners? Like what is the story behind these, households that are accessing our permanent housing projects as a first touch in our homeless response system? I also look at the intersectionality or like the interplay between emergency shelter. You see this arrow kind of going down and over to PSH. We've got 6% of our households went from shelter over to PSH, and 3% went from shelter to rapid rehousing, and 3% went from shelter to transitional housing. And then I also look at who exited to permanent, or the percentage of folks that exited to permanent destinations upon exiting the pathway, basically. So we have 21% that navigated emergency shelter and safe haven and exited to permanent destinations. We have 88% of our folks that exited rapid rehousing exited to permanent destinations. 11% that exited PSH that exited to permanent destinations, 43% of transitional housing folks that exited to permanent destinations, and 50% of these all other pathways. The question that I would have for this community is you've got 11% of the households that exited PSH exiting to permanent destinations. Where are households going in your system when they exit PSH if they are not exiting to permanent? Like that's a really low percent for PSH specifically. So just curious where they're going when they're exiting, if not to a permanent destination.
The bulk of those exits should be accounted for by housing searchers who never leased up or had a housing move-in date and their certificate expired through PSH. In our community, housing inventory is very low. We don't have enough housing stock to meet demand for certificates and housing across all markets, not just low income or homeless housing.
Perfect. And also, Brian, don't feel put on the spot. Like I'm asking these questions, this is hypothetical. It's great that you're here, but if like you don't have an answer and there needs to be more context given at another time, that's great too. And then we have our returns arrow in red at the bottom that goes, back into the system. how many of our households did, and then the average days it took for them to return back to our system after they exited to permanent destinations. We didn't talk through the differences between the system performance measures and the LSA today, but I highlight the distinction between the individuals and the households, especially with this measure, because the system performance measures does look at the data by individuals. And the example that I use is actually this returns to homelessness measure, because both the system performance measures and the LSA look at returns to homelessness. But if you have a household of 5 individuals exit to a permanent destination and only one of them returns to the system, that one person is going to be captured in the returns to homelessness in your system performance measures, but it will not be captured here in Stella or the LSA, because again, that difference in, we're looking at households here, we're looking at individuals and SPNs. Anything on the system map that folks want to ask before we pivot to some performance measures? There are a lot of drop downs. As I said, there's a lot of data here and a lot of ways that you could cut this data and play with it. Okay, Chris, if we scroll back up to the top and click on our days homeless, that's our first performance measure. And again, there's different sub tabs here, but I'm going to focus on the by population group one. So this is what is going to break out and visualize the data and break it out by race and ethnicity. So the first thing I look at is at the very top, it's showing our average days experiencing homelessness for all households in our system, which was that 98 days. It also shows on the right-hand side here. The first thing that I do is I look for average days that are higher than our average, our universal average. And the first one that I see is our adult only 55 plus households have an average length of time experiencing homelessness of 146 days in our system. That's significantly higher than our universal measure or our universal average. And so my question would be like, what is it about our adult only 55 plus households that are having them experience homelessness longer in our system than other subpopulations? Same thing with our adult and child with 3 or more children, which I think HUD defines as like a big household, which is a little surprising because I have 3 children. I don't think of my household as a big household, but apparently that's a thing. So that average days is up to 248. That's really, really high. And you also have to factor in your N. So your universe here, we're talking 10 households, right? 10 households that had adults and children that were 3 or more children in their household. It's not a huge universe, but I think it's still interesting to look at why this average days is so much higher than our universal measure. And it could just be, it's harder to house a family with 3 or more children and meet, housing quality standards and all of the different pieces, room ratios and all of that. So that could be the reason, but without knowing the local context, like I don't know that for sure. By race, at least. So it starts to break down by race. And again, we have our white non-Hispanic. Our white Hispanic is the only place that Hispanic shows up. Again, I find that to be an issue and have elevated that to the APT team. But again, it's trying to incorporate that into the LSA programming specs. We have Black, African American, Asian, American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander in multiple races. So looking down by race and ethnicity, not seeing a ton of disparities in those breakouts. I'm actually curious what's working well for Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islanders, because their average days is so much lower than the overall average. But again, if you look at our universe, we're only talking about 4 households here. So we have to factor that in as well. And then we have also some other subpopulations. So those fleeing domestic violence, which again, remember this data is only coming from our HMIS. So this isn't talking about like our victim services providers. We don't have any VSP data in here. So it's literally those households that identify their fleeing domestic violence from our HMIS. We have have a disabled member, have a housing movement or PSH housing movement date specifically, the first time experiencing homelessness, and then returners from a permanent destination. Across the bottom of this, there's a show additional data, and there's a little box for self-reported days homeless. If you click that, that is going to incorporate our approximate days homelessness started data element. Now you see that this data changed fairly significantly and added some significant, wow, I didn't look at this before, but some significant days homeless. Our overall average is now 2,000 days. I think one of the first things I would ask about this, yeah, sorry, I didn't look at this one before now, but like one of the first things that I would ask about this is how is our approximate date homelessness started data element being explained to folks that we are gathering data from? And it could be that you have a lot of folks who have been experiencing homelessness for a very long time in your community. This is like across the board here. It added a significant number of days to our average days experiencing homelessness. Oh, Brian, and this could be like, is this due to your migration, right? We have to factor that in too. I don't know.
It's more a data collection training issue and getting all end users up to speed and people collecting data with updating that date experience homelessness. Very frequently, people will start enrollments and just it'll carry over from the previous enrollment and several data points don't get updated. Because you can look at HMIS records and see exits to permanent housing since that move-in date for clients, or see actual enrollments in housing programs with move-in dates that show data impossibilities with that homeless start date. It's just not updated as often as it should be.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great point and really great context. I would also, so I think that this is a place where I would definitely call into question, like, are there data quality considerations here or data collection considerations as you're understanding and analyzing this data? You will also see that the disparities changed when we added this. Our adult only 55 plus households still have a significantly longer average days experiencing homelessness than the universal measure, but our adults and children with 3 or more, or families with children with 3 or more children, like that actually decreased significantly. So is that data quality? Is that, is that something? It's all just, this is very interesting. And absent the self-reported days, I didn't say this earlier, but like just without the self-reported days homeless box checked, that is only solely based on HMIS enrollment information, the average days before. Okay, any questions on this metric? I'm looking at by race and ethnicity. Are folks getting into Stella? You're starting to understand her a little bit. All right, we're gonna go over to the exits tab and then by population group again in that sub tab. And this looks at our exits to permanent destinations. So there's a way to print all this data for folks that don't have access to directly to HDX2, which we'll get to at the end. But the reason I mention that is because there's a lot more interactivity that you can do if you have direct access to HDX. So the printout will default to the settings and the visualizations that each page is defaulting to right now. One of the first things that I do here, because this page can be hard to read and look for disparities, is I click on the all destination types box and click only on permanent destinations. So we see that our all exiting households have a 25% exit destination rate. But then if I look down, I can see who has a higher and then who has a lower very easily and much more easily than when all the destinations are there. Yeah, Johnny?
So you had asked a question if we were getting a vision on how to use Stella here. And I think it's pretty user-friendly when you get into it. And I know Chris mentioned this earlier, but my big question for us, and maybe this might not be the right time to answer it, like we don't have a big use for it because it doesn't include coordinated entries. So like these numbers, exited to permanent destinations, well, I looking at Brian's numbers where there's somebody that said 2,000 or 4,000 days of homelessness, like that's not uncommon in our area for some people who might come in for day services, who just shower, do laundry. they might even be on a list for shelter, but since they never get into shelter, they're not going to hit this, right? And then the same thing for the exits and the returns. If we get them sheltered, for them to show return to homeless, they got to get back into at least a shelter. They can't just be a regular coordinated entry day service person, correct? So I know ICF doesn't own Stella, it's a HUD thing and stuff, but we don't see a real benefit in using it for our numbers. We have to use numbers on our coordinated entry people. So is this mostly just to try and see if you can find disparities? I mean, because when we look at the overall numbers, when people look at, they look at our numbers, they go, wow, you're exiting so many people to permanent destinations and there's so few returns to homelessness. And it's like, well, that's not really the truth. It's just the way of looking at it through this report.
Yeah, that's a helpful context and helpful question. What I often do with communities is I ask them to triangulate their data. So what I usually ask for if I'm going to do a comprehensive data analysis for a community is their PIT data, because it does have some benefits, right? Like you've got the unsheltered data set that you may not be able to find anywhere else. You have some VSP data that isn't disaggregated in the PIT, but you have some of that you won't find in HMIS data. Ask for their Stella P data, and then I ask for any data they have related to coordinated entry, knowing that that's not going to be captured in their Stella P. I know that APT is working on a coordinated entry specific dashboard. I don't know when they're even going to have that available for piloting, but that is something that will be available to communities in addition to Stella P.
And I think Johnny, just to kind of put my 2 cents on this, when we were working with HUD to put the system performance measures and the Stella all together, we wanted to see everything. I think the logistics came down to, it was very difficult for them to program everything and get it to actually be meaningful. And I certainly understand you, the setter, better than HUD does as far as how you perform services. The way they decided in the end to exclude coordinated entry or excludes street outreach is going to make your data less useful to you, which means it just is more work upon us to use Stella Plus, like Alyssa just said. I am very hopeful at some point after Stella M is birthed that we can look at other things in the system performance measures and in Stella P to make it more comprehensive. I mean, as a person who does a lot of work in the street outreach environment, when you look at the system performance measures, there's only one measure for street outreach. I don't think that's an accurate measure. It's how many folks get permanent housing in street outreach. But to me, the most accurate measure is how many folks that in a street outreach environment have a positive housing destination. Coming off the streets is positive, is that, doesn't have to necessarily be permanent. We want it to be that, but it could be something else. So there's a lot of ways to redesign this data analysis locally. This is just a starting point.
Thanks.
Yeah. Yep. Chelsea?
I just wanted to add in that that's what we have been doing. We realize that the LSA data isn't something that we can report on to anybody in our area. And so I've been working with our provider and trying to recreate the LSA, the way that it's pulled within our coordinated entry. And that's really surprised us with the data that we've gotten back. And we're still in the process of fighting through that. But we did find that helpful to take this and put it into there.
That's great, Chelsea. And I think I'll just echo this. Thank you for the Burke household showing up well today and our U.S. Setter friends. Also, Alyssa and I are working with HCD and our partners at BCSH with the HDIS project to develop some system performance measures for the ESG program. And when we started conceptualizing that, we started pulling apart some of the things that HUD had to make decisions on. As I said, for us, when we talk about street outreach, any positive housing destination, we're going to consider that positive. So we've created a metric for that. And that is something that we'll be able to use for ESG programs statewide, which is great. You'll be able to use that. We'll be able to use that. But we were very intentional in not following what Stella or what the system performance measures do, because we wanted to expand the universe as broad as we could to get the most accurate picture possible. Yeah. Unless anything to say about that project, it's been a fun one so far.
It is fun. I think they're still getting their feet under them as well, of like all the data it's the first time that the state of California has had access to across the board, across the state, from 47 something different. HMIS, you know, it's a lot, but it's exciting. For the permanent destinations piece, we've got some really small ends here. So when I look at our Black and African American households exiting to permanent destinations, that's the first one that I see that is significantly lower than our universal average. And recognizing that the total number of households that exited from that subpopulation is only 15 households and only 2 exited to permanent destinations. Again, small ends, but I think it's really worth digging into at the local level to understand that, if there's, you know, something to be said for that. I mean, our Asian households are even smaller. There were only 2 Asian households that exited in the reporting period, and none of them exited to permanent destinations. So again, just thinking through what that looks like and how to navigate those small ends.
And I believe, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, but upon further analysis on top of this Stella data, the racial equity disparities that we really saw were actually a little different than what this data says, which is it's American Indian / Native Alaskan that have the worst housing outcomes. Is that what I recall?
They're the largest inequity is the rate at which they're experiencing homelessness in our community. As a portion of our population, it's double. So once they're in the housing system, the outcomes aren't too bad. Their housing move-in dates and things are a little disproportionate, but using the California HCIS system, we reviewed it in our HMIS committee about half a year ago. And the big outlier is the rate at which Native American populations experience homelessness. And this is underreported because we don't have tribal entities really actively using our HMIS yet. So even being underreported, that population experiences homelessness and poverty at a rate well above its representative population in the overall community.
Thank you for that.
All right, let's go up to our third, so returns and by population group, and just recognizing that we've gone through kind of our big 3 performance measures. So average days experiencing homelessness, exits to permanent destination, and returns to homelessness after exits. And while we have kind of looked at them in isolation of each other, one of the things that I think is really important is to look at them in conjunction with each other. So again, I'm going to pick on our adult only 55+ households. They had a significantly longer period of time experiencing homelessness in our system. They were exiting to permanent destinations at right around, you know, the rate of our universal average. And then they're returning at a slightly higher rate. So taking all of that together, what's going on with our adult only 55+ households? Same thing with our adult, like our big families. I don't know how else to say that. Our large families, as HUD defines it. They were experiencing homelessness for a very long period of time in our system. They were exiting, I believe what I saw was at a higher, like a significantly higher rate to permanent destinations from our system. And then they're returning at a lower rate. So, you know, could it be that families with children, with 3 or more children, are experiencing homelessness longer, but they're getting better exits and they're returning less often? So maybe that's not, I mean, yes, I think we need to create some strategies to make sure that they're not experiencing homelessness as long. But if we're still getting them into permanent housing upon exiting and they're not returning, like overall, that's, you know, that's a decent picture. So 40% is our universal measure for those who are returning. Again, our adult only 55s are returning at a slightly higher rate. Our parenting youth households didn't have any returns, but again, if we look at our universe, it's pretty small. Adult, our big families, they're returning at a lower rate. Our white non-Hispanic, I mean, I think that's where the average comes from. I think that's the biggest N in this system. Our white Hispanic folks are returning at a slightly higher rate. Our Black African American households are returning at a much higher rate. Again, it's a small N, but with if you partnered that with like they're exiting to permanent destinations at a much lower rate, and now they're returning at a much higher rate, regardless of how small our universe is, I think that's something to look into. And that would be something that I would flag on a data analysis. We have our 1 Asian household that exited and then returned. So again, small n, but they came back. And otherwise, most of this looks on point. Any questions about returns? So this does have a look back period. If you scroll up, Chris, maybe it explains a little bit. It's looking at exits that happened before the reporting period. Selected in, so they exited. Who returned within 6 months. Percent and number of households in each population group that exit the home system and percent and number of exiting households who return within 6 months. So there we go. Yes. So we have the households that exited in the 12 months prior to the current reporting period. So for this one, the current reporting period is 10/1/19 through 9/30/2020. So if you click on that 12-month, right, this is showing households that exited 12 months before 10/1/19 through 9/30/20. Does that change that much? It did decrease the overall returns to homelessness significantly. Yeah. Okay. And then exited between 12 and 24 months. So even looking back even further, up to 2 years before the current reporting period. And that percentage went down again of returns. Okay. Any questions on returns or just thinking through these different performance measures in conjunction with each other for a specific subpopulation to try and understand kind of that overall picture? So the last tab that we have is the demographics, and there's some demographics overview, and you have our different drop downs. So it defaults to all households and then served in shelters and transitional housing specifically, but you do have these served in any project type too, if you want to look at demographics for all of the projects that are included in the LSA. I think this is the only place, and it only for a few of these demographics does it show the minors, like the age breakout. But it will tell you whether it's, everybody or whether it's just head of households and adults. So we have our gender breakout, our age breakout, our race and ethnicity breakout, our household composition. And then a little bit further down, we have veterans, domestic violence, chronic homeless status and disabling condition, system engagement, so first time, returning, re-engaging, continuously experiencing homelessness, and then geography, which I don't think I realized that Mendocino was rural.
Yes, 0% have been served in the Mendocino city. I guess we're considering all of Mendocino rural.
And then I do look at the prior living situation for households. Can you actually scroll back up and click default back to shelter and transitional housing? Oh, it is. Okay. I like to look at the prior living situation by these different drop downs. So sometimes I've seen for shelter and transitional housing, the prior living situation be significantly higher for like permanent housing. And then I have a question of like, why is that the case? Because they're accessing shelter and transitional housing. So if their prior living situation is a rental or PSH or something, like what's going on there? The other sub-tab is one that I definitely focus on. So I think that is comparison or something. Can't remember what it's called. Yep, the comparison one. So we have the race and ethnicity of households and head of households and adults broken out by project type here. So if you scroll down just a little bit, Chris. We have, so The colored bars, right, indicate the different race and ethnicity breakouts that we have. And we see that for emergency shelter, safe haven, and transitional housing, this cutoff of the number of households in that program, in those project types that are white, non-Hispanic, non-Latino. I compare that to the race and ethnicity breakdown for rapid housing and PSH. And this trend that we're seeing right here is something that I have consistently seen in a lot of the analyses that I'm doing. So what this is telling me is that you have a specific percentage or rate of folks who are white and non-Hispanic accessing emergency shelter, safe haven, or transitional housing in your system, but they are accessing PSH at a higher rate than they're being seen in like your homeless services or emergency response part of your system. So what is it? What context, what story behind the data do we have of why are more white people basically accessing PSH than are able to access emergency shelter and transitional housing? I'm sorry, Brian, I don't mean to make you cry so much today. You are not alone in this though. Like this is a thing, this is a trend that we are seeing in the LSA data and the Stella data. And I don't know the answers, right? I don't have the answers, but part of me wants to ask the question of like, how is your coordinated entry prioritizing folks for PSH? What vulnerabilities are you measuring for? Because we know that PSH is meant for the most vulnerable in our communities. We know that PSH is typically accessing and receiving referrals from coordinated entry. We know that coordinated entry prioritizes households based on vulnerability. How is that process happening and how is it potentially feeding into disparities in your homeless response system and who is able to ultimately access those limited services? So again, this is not the only time I've seen this. It actually surprises me at this point when I don't see it, to be very honest. Any questions on any of this?
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So like just now, the question I guess that Brian will be looking at is, why would one group seem to be doing better in one area than another, right? And you'd suggested, Alyssa, that to go back and look at the coordinated entry process to figure out how that's going on. Do you get, when we've started looking at race demographics over the last year, we've been really fortunate in our area. I don't know if fortunate's the word, but we haven't had any major demographic issues that we can find. One of the things that makes, at least compared to our overall population and to our population of homeless folks, one of the things I had thought early on was, and I'll just give an example. If I was looking at numbers and let's say my homeless population was 20% African-American and 10% of our shelters or 10% of permanent housing was African-American, I would see a 10% disparity there, right? That wouldn't make sense. So do you ever recommend that when there is a disparity, that the coordinated entry process adds like a point for vulnerability for a certain either ethnic or demographic?
So I will start, but I'm going to kick it over to Mary Frances as well, because they are heavily involved in race equity initiative that focuses on this type of thing. I would love to say yes, I would love to say do it, but I also think that there's some caution around fair housing and some other pieces. So there might be ways to basically do that without outright doing it. So finding proxies for doing basically that. I know that some folks have used like zip code and where are you coming from and some other pieces like that we know disproportionately impact people of color that you can incorporate without it outright being like, oh, you're Black, I'm going to give you a point for that kind of thing. Mary, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, so I don't have my HUD TA provider hat on today, so I'll be just as candid and transparent as I possibly can. There are some communities that have decided to do what they feel is in their best interest for addressing racial and ethnic disparities. So one of those communities is Seattle King County. During COVID, they did amend their COVID prioritization to include race and ethnicity as a prioritization factor. And I think the mayor gave them an award for doing so. That being said, HUD is pretty clear at this moment that race cannot be used as a prioritization factor, and there are a number of arguments on both sides. I would say on the in favor side, the argument is, well, we use protected class for prioritization all the time. We do it with people who have disabling conditions, right? That is prioritization for permanent supportive housing, and there is no fair housing argument on that end. On the other side, it's kind of the opposite argument, which is, you can't use race as a protected class. Similar to Alyssa's response, I think thinking about Montgomery County, Maryland, who came up with their own homelessness prevention index for their COVID response. They didn't use race explicitly as a prioritization factor, but what they did do was look at sort of the history of segregation in the county. They looked at where poverty is concentrated, and they developed a map using, Argus technology, and they prioritize communities that have heavy concentration of populations who identify as Black or Latinx. It's a pretty amazing tool. It's publicly available. They've, put it out there for the world to see. And I think similarly, San Jose in California did something like that with some of their CARES Act resources for eviction prevention. If you are interested in doing it, I don't know what the end result would be from a HUD perspective. I can't speak to that because communities are doing it, and I don't know if I'm aware of any of the implications. If you want to not be as explicit, but still figure out ways to prioritize, looking at your redlining maps in your community is a great starting point. Seeing where there are concentrated pockets of poverty. I know we don't collect zip code anymore. Chris, you got your screen up, wrong screen. We're in the twilight zone here at ICF because we post gifts all day. But really using that information, using census information can help you prioritize some of your vulnerable populations that are experiencing disparities without explicitly saying Black or, Alaska Native or Pacific Islander or Asian American. I hope that at some point we will be in a place where things are different and we have clearer guidance around how we can be even more explicit in addressing racial and ethnic disparities in our systems, where we just haven't evolved that much. We haven't evolved, but there are some workarounds.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'll add to that conversation, we've seen folks do a bunch of different things around prioritization that have definitely been not kosher with fair housing. So we want to avoid those. So I think what Mary Frances said, I've also heard Alyssa talk about, social determinants of health, other things that we know affect persons of color at a different rate. I think going back to the original conversation that we were having, Johnny, there's also a possibility that your data set itself doesn't have the right universe, and that you're not able to see the true disparities within your data because the agencies, programs, and or clients you're looking for don't access the programs that you have. And I think that comes from maybe we're not funding the right projects, we're not hitting our persons of color with the right funding sources, or they're just not a place that we've kind of explored before. Brian mentioned the tribal nations within Mendocino County. They are using HMIS now, but only for a little bit. And, as they get more funding, whether that be from the state or other places or CDBG, and they have more programs, they need more data in HMIS, we're going to get a better picture of what's happening with that tribal nation. But if we don't have the tribal nation, we're completely blind to it. So we can't just, assume that the data that we have covers enough of the universe of our programs to really be useful. We might have to go outside of our HMS to do so. All right, I think we're done with Stella. Alyssa, can I pull this down and put the presentation back up, or just pull this down?
Yeah, I did want to spend just a couple quick minutes. Sorry, yes, please pull it down. Please bring back up the presentation. I did want to spend a couple quick minutes on the data analysis or the data set that we have for the California CSC, specifically based on the Stella data. So I'm going to ask you to share your screen on that one. The link.
All right.
Chris is still a newbie on the multiple screens thing. It's really great to watch him struggle with this, actually. So what we received are some basic measures from different COCs across the state of California. It's not all of them, but it's many of them. 40 of them. So what we have is some basic demographics, and it defaults to California 500, but you should be able to, in the dropdowns, find, you know, if your data set is in here, find yours and look at it. It's going to show the percent of folks that identified as different race and or ethnicity based on Stella. It's going to show who was accessing emergency shelter and transitional housing by race and ethnicity. It's going to show you the average length of time experiencing homelessness by race and ethnicity, the returns to homelessness by race and ethnicity. And then, can you scroll back up? So we have accessing PSH. So again, that piece around, okay, we looked at this in Stella too, but who is accessing emergency shelter and TH versus who is able to access PSH. And then there was an additional measure that I don't think we touched on in Stella P specifically, but looking at who is exiting to permanent housing in general. So, well, that's our permanent housing destinations. But what I like to look at in this specific data set is looking at all three of these, the accessing ES and TH, the accessing PSH, and the exiting PH together. So we see, you know, 70% of our, well, let's look at Hispanic Latino. 9% of folks accessing ES and TH are identifying as white, Hispanic, and Latino, or Latinx. 13% are exiting to permanent housing. And then if we scroll up, who's accessing, or the percentage of folks accessing PSH? 8%. So slightly, you know, 1% less who's accessing PSH, but they are exiting to permanent housing at a slightly higher rate than they're being seen in emergency shelter and TH. So like, where are they exiting to that's permanent housing? Is it wraparound housing? Is it some other like rental with no ongoing housing subsidy? Is it staying or living with family or friends permanently? Like, what are those additional permanent housing destinations that isn't PSH that is allowing or having white, Hispanic, Latinx folks exit to other permanent housing destinations? Chris, were you going to add something? Oh, okay. I thought it was
Only that I once again picked on California 509s. This is Mendocino County again, since we were just trying to keep it consistent. That's all.
So you have access to this. This is a public Tableau dashboard. You have to hunt for it, but the link is in the presentation slides. And there is a statewide view too, but I don't know how useful that is. Because again, like we really want to look at some of this data at the local level.
And I did put the link in the chat so you can have it. And as Alyssa said, once you get the materials from after the session, the link's in there too. This data came from your Stella data that you submitted for your ESGCV round 2 data, round 2 application. So we had all that data. We just compiled it into a dashboard for you.
So some of the, again, like, and I think Mary mentioned this earlier, that the data across different COCs look very, very different. The disparities that you see in different COCs are very, very different. There were some common trends though. One of those common trends was very similar to what I showed earlier about white folk, the percentage or rate of white folks accessing emergency shelter and TH, and then the rate at which they're accessing PSH. So on the flip side, we see that Black African-American households are accessing PSH and other services at a lesser rate than their overall experiencing homelessness. They were also exiting to that permanent housing destinations at higher rates. So again, like what additional exits to permanent housing are Black African American households exiting to that aren't PSH? And this specific trend was across different, like several different COCs. So curious about that. And then we have, again, this white non-Hispanic households were accessing PSH at a much higher rate than they were found in who was experiencing homelessness overall. And then white Hispanic households were accessing PSH at a much lower rate than found in households experiencing homelessness. So again, like, why is this happening? Because I don't have the answer to that. I just have the numbers. So like, I don't know the local context.
All right, Alyssa, thank you. I'm going to walk us through the last few slides and lead any conversation that folks need. If you need to leave, please do, but stick around if you can. So you have some resources here. Again, these will be provided to you afterwards. You can click on them, go into them that you need. So you'll have access to all these. I want to thank you for attending this session. If you have any discussion topics, questions, or anything we can answer right now, we'll do that. Otherwise, we'll begin to wrap up, but I'll give it another minute or two since we do have 2 minutes left for questions, comments, or discussion. I'm not seeing any, so thank you for joining us. I'm going to do a little bit of closing and then let you go. So thank you for attending this California Housing and Community Development workshop session offered through the Emergency Solutions Grant Coronavirus Relief Consulting and Staffing Services Contract. This was session 2 of Racial Equity in Data. You'll be receiving a survey from Aaron Rutherford. Aaron, thank you for all of your help today, keeping this session moving. We'll give you the recording, the PowerPoint, and ask you to complete a survey to see where you would like to take this. So we can continue doing small group sessions. We can go and talk specifically to a community's data set and help you work through that. We have lots of different options that you might be able to unlock through this racial equity and data session series. So look for that survey, fill it out, and we'll bring us back together as a group if you all want to come back together as a group. So we use those surveys as a real way to direct the next step in these series. So any questions before we wrap up? I'm seeing none. Thank you for your time and attendance. We're right on time. We will see you next time. Look for that survey and we will set up another one. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.